Welcome, everybody. Today, I'm very pleased to bring you a conversation with Dr. Gary Fettke. For those of you who are not familiar with him and his work, Dr. Fettke is a retired orthopedic surgeon from Tasmania here in Australia and an early adopter and pioneer in the world of low carb, healthy fat nutrition,
Correct.
which we were just debating as to whether it was high fat or healthy fat. Dr. Fettke, you're very firm that it's healthy fat.
Hi, Simon. Look, I should openly declare my primary conflict of interest. I do have lowcarbhealthyfat.com. I have done absolutely nothing with it. But I registered that some years ago because I do think I think we don't want to get stigmatized, and I don't think you need to live healthy by having a high fat diet. It's a higher fat than what we've been told to have, but it's nuances, but nuances rule the world.
Yeah.
Um, I'm retired from clinical practice, but very active with giving second and third opinions all the time. Still
Warranted
actively
or
involved.
unwarranted?
Well, no, I'm generally asked, and I mean, I've spoken many times about. I think the sickness industry, it's not a health system, is terribly flawed, and so I'm not surprised that when I'm asked for second or third opinions that I differ from the mainstream opinion. And a lot of time just comes back down to the basics. But my I'm still doing a lot on guideline work as well as health advocacy, as well as bringing the establishment into line, which is really the APRA cause for most people who are caught up by the regulatory authority. So I'm damn busy. So long and short of it is I've been an orthopedic surgeon for 35 years or so, and in my time I looked after a lot of the patients that no one else wanted to look after. So I ended up with I actually changed my letterhead, specialising in everything that nobody else wants to do. And I've got a golden toilet brush behind me, which I point out because my registrars gave that because I used to get to clean up all the whatever that was left around.
Uh,
And
what
the
are- what what
result,
what are we talking? What sort of
everything.
sickness?
So my clinics were called Fettke's effed up fructose-free fungating foot folly Fridays. So when let's say there's a 200 kilo 5 foot woman who breaks her femur, then who stands up to actually do that operation because nobody else wants to do it.
Mm.
So and so a lot of times I was sort of when someone you ask, please step forward, who wants to volunteer to do something, and everyone takes a step backwards. And I said, just put her on the Friday list, put her on the Friday list. So for many years, I did less than 10 electives in a year, 10 of elective operations. So you were put on my elective waiting list. Chances are you were unlikely to be operated on for a
Wow.
long time. And that's not because I didn't want to. I was just doing all the Friday stuff, which had the trauma that nobody wanted to do, the trauma
Mm.
patients that were left over, and these often very sick people. So my practice evolved into that, and particularly the diabetic foot complications. And over the years, I came to realize that we've got a tsunami of ill health, which is just overwhelming the system. And I've never really been a complainer. People might think so, but I often generally identify a problem and come up with a solution. So part of it was, look, I've got these patients who are terrible metabolic health. And I said, well, this is what I can do as a surgeon, but this is what I need you to do to improve your health and well-being before I operate or after I operate, just because that's part of it. And part of it in hospital is I want to actually give my patients some decent protein and some good food in hospital. And the kicker for me was I had a guy in his 40s and he'd have his both legs amputated because of diabetic complications. And he was in hospital. I'm trying to save his legs, and he's eating ice cream.
Oh,
And I said, WTF, as politically correct as I could at the time. And they said, oh, that's the guidelines. The guidelines for people with diabetes in hospitals, they're allowed to have 3 ice creams per day, 3 desserts per day, um, chocolate chip cookies, fruit juices, soft drink, whatever, because you're not allowed to discriminate against people with diabetes. And that was really the turning point for me when I came to realize, hang on, our problems in society, primary problems in metabolic health, has comes from what we eat. And it's particularly our diet, which is high in ultra processed foods, which largely comes down to too much sugar, too much refined carbohydrate, and the polyunsaturated seed oils. And so all I wanted to do for my patients was to give them some protein and sort of try and get some control of their diabetes. So I had to get to the point of prescribing eggs on the diet, on the hospital chart, had to prescribe a piece of cheese because it couldn't be given to them on a regular basis. And just with that simple intervention of that and some really radical full fat yogurt,
Hmm.
given, not forcing the patients, but given the option, you could see some of these ulcers start to heal, start to turn around and improve their health. By way of how bad hospital food is, I had a patient in hospital for a year, multiple fractures, super obese, multiple complications. And at the end of 12 months, I put an incident report in because that's the only way you sort of generate stuff in the hospitals. Because this woman had put on 30 kilos of weight in hospital, so trying to get best possible care. She's already morbidly obese and she's put on another 30 kilos. And on the government hospital guideline recommended foods. Anyway, so in the process of this, I proudly, in about 2013, came up with this nutritional model of modern disease, which was based around inflammation. I proudly, I think I'm the first person in the world to describe it. The combination of sugar, refined carbohydrate, and polyunsaturated oils equals inflammation. Inflammation sits behind every single medical problem we face on as humans, and half of the animal kingdom as well. And as a result of that, if we do the opposite of that, which is to reduce our sugar, reduce our carbs, and reduce our seed oils, remaining taking processed food out of the diet, we'll actually get healthier. So I was trying to institute that with my patients, started having a Barney with the hospital system, the dietitians. I was giving medical grand round lectures, which was really interesting as a surgeon, because the physicians were interested because I was talking biochemistry and clinical practice. Anyway, the dietitians didn't like that. I got on this thing called social media. Within 48 hours, I was targeted by someone who was working with Coca-Cola. Within months, I came under the umbrella of other people. Again, this is an orthopedic surgeon in the backwater of the world called Tasmania. And but it wasn't long before I ended up being targeted. Now, this is all in retrospect. We found this out by by the breakfast cereal industry, who were working. They were being paying the Dietitians Association of Australia to advocate for the benefits of sugar and cereal. Hard to believe that's actually KPIs, and they were funded by the breakfast cereal industry to promote the benefits of sugar and cereal to the Australian population. And then the CEO of the Dietitians Association is contacting the CEO of the hospital, pretty well demanding in two pieces of correspondence that I be silenced. And then in the process of that, got reported to the medical board on a few occasions, 3 occasions specifically, and took nearly 5 years to clear my name. Presented to a couple of Senate inquiries along the way, and the problems of APRA, problems of obesity in Australia, problems of food labelling. And because they effectively ruled to take away my medical license if I recommended this, even if it became best practice in the future. So ultimately, social media was my undoing, but social media and the population, the people, came to my rescue, because the amount of heat that was put on the medical regulator by the public, because it was just stupid. Ultimately, I was telling my patients to avoid eating sugar. That was the one question they asked of me. Do you think that telling your patients to avoid eating sugar is specific nutritional advice? One question. Had my lawyer sitting behind me, and I went, yes. And my lawyer, after we left, said, you probably should have said no. But anyway, they ruled that against me, and then it took years and intervention of the National Ombudsman, repeat review,
So
and I was finally cleared.
Does that mean in that period of time you couldn't work?
It affected my practice, but they allowed me to keep doing orthopedic surgery, but I wasn't allowed to tell a patient who was overweight that there were options for them.
Yeah, okay.
Effectively.
Yeah.
Because it was outside of my scope of practice, which is complete BS, because a medical degree starts in your first year of medicine, you do biochemistry. And the biochemistry we're talking about is not rocket science, not in the last few hundred pages, the first pages of a biochemistry and physiology textbook. Let's call it the Kreb Cycle. And we should, that's the basis. A medical degree is based in science. It's not based in arts or something, even though realistically it is an art. And so biochemistry was really brought into question in all of this. I pretty much did a PhD through the process of defending this. My case was behind closed door here in Australia. Tim Noakes's case was an open case in South Africa. Tim and I were in constant communication. We were sort of sharing some material, but nonetheless, it was just a kangaroo court here in Australia because I literally had to defend the benefits of eating whole food.
Mm.
And as it turned out, the expert witness that was supplied to the medical board failed to declare that he was actually working for the breakfast cereal industry and had been doing for 15 years and been writing their textbooks for the Dietitians Association and was a life member of the Dietitians Association. So, and I had been named by the breakfast cereal industry for specific targeting. So part of me was, in retrospect, and we've got the minutes of all that, to be targeted for active defence, because these people were causing a financial loss because cereal sales in Australia and New Zealand were down because of the concepts of low carb and paleo at that time. But we'd flow on to what that actually means now with essentially keto and carnivore. So, if most people who know me, one of the great things about being an orthopedic surgeon is that we're stubborn and we're arrogant. Right? And because you need to back yourself. That's surgery. I'm not apologising for every surgeon on the planet, but it requires a mindset to actually take on patients. You've only got the skills of your hand and your team, and you need to. But when you know you're right, that stubbornness kicks in. It is a family trait if you go back through my mother and grandmother, but nonetheless, we were there. I was defending science, I was defending biochemistry, and I was also defending the right of free speech and the right of giving directed clinical care, which is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to not follow, we say follow the damn guidelines, and we can talk about how guidelines have been manipulated for a long time. But clinical care should be directed to an individual based on the individual problem. But the problem now is we've got 93% of the population are metabolically unwell. And primarily that's due to our lifestyle, and the primary issue in our lifestyle is our diet. So the vast majority of our health problems are lifestyle related and require lifestyle management, not this whole barrage of drugs and nonsense which is being pushed. And you've got to go and exercise more and try and outrun it. And bearing in mind that the term exercise is medicine, have you heard that term?
Yeah.
Do you know where that came from?
Well, I do because I've heard your talks before.
Yeah. But essentially, it's the motto. It's the primary motto of the American Sports Medicine Association, and that's their mantra: exercise is medicine. But the thing is, the initial funding of that Sports Medicine Association comes from Coca-Cola. So effectively, the message of exercise is medicine is a funding message by Coca-Cola. It's part of their health washing. That's why Coca-Cola actually funds. The longest running, sponsor of the modern Olympic Games is Coca-Cola, and they sponsor FIFA. They have got their tentacles in all sorts of places. So when you actually realise that our guidelines are manipulated, the messages sent out are manipulated, then we get caught up in this whole process of trying to work out disinformation, misinformation, whichever way you call it. So I call it disinformation because I think it's deliberate misinformation by the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry. So I may seem like a naysayer, but essentially all I kept coming back with is this is biochemistry 101. This is the basic thing. And the old Kreb cycle, just in brief, is how we as members of the animal kingdom, this is including insects right through to birds and humans, we turn food into energy. So it either becomes and food only comes in three forms. It comes in protein, fats, and carbohydrates, and then they can go into the Krebs cycle. It comes out the other end essentially as adenosine triphosphate. It turns into acetyl-CoA that enters this cycle of which ATP comes out, which is really the energy of our bodies. And therefore, as I'll sometimes say in talks, God wasn't stupid enough to make us completely dependent on one seasonal food, which is carbohydrate. And proteins and fats are present all year round. They're not seasonal, and there is no biochemical pathway in the body that requires us to eat carbohydrate. I've been challenged on it. I've actually caught up with Luke Tappy, who was the biggest researcher into this period about fructose in particular. I've asked him to his face at a Coca-Cola conference, which was fun. Professor Tappy, is there a single biochemical pathway which requires us to ingest fructose? And he went, no. Got it shouted down from the audience and the other speakers. But I said, that's all I need to know. That's that. We don't need to eat sugar. We don't need to eat fructose. We don't need to eat glucose. It can come to us via a variety of different pathways. So ultimately, I'm an advocate for free, real food. I have rewritten the dietary guidelines for the world and the animal kingdom in one sentence, which is eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food. That's our ancestral diet. That's the way we evolved, our evolutionary diet. That's where the entire animal kingdom, when it doesn't have access to processed food, that's what it eats. And one of the classic things we keep failing to observe, or we see but we don't observe, is that if you look at the animal kingdom, how many are fat and obese?
None.
0. Sure, if they eat trash food which is left over from our produce that we've left in rubbish bins and whatever, that's a difference.
Dog eats a heap of bread and pasta, etc., it gets fat. But
yes, and often you can, it's not surprising. Sometimes you look at dogs and their owners look the same. It's a tragedy. We had one of our dietitians just, when it was working for us. She had a dog that was unwell, and then Belinda said to her one day, this is my wife, Belinda, just one day I said, "What are you feeding the dog?" And the dietitian went, "Oh my God!" She had this light bulb moment, and she realised she'd been giving it just, dog food. So she immediately just gave it chicken wings and chicken, and the dog was healthy within a week.
Mm.
You know who owns who's the biggest food supplier, dog food supplier, pet food supplier in Australia?
In Australia, I'm not sure.
Who owns it?
No.
Yeah, Mars Confectionery.
Yeah, I was going to guess Nestle or something like that.
Yeah, no, but it's the old confectionery industry.
Yeah.
It's still family owned, Mars. But anyway.
Highly processed dog biscuits with all sorts of stuff. If you have a look in those ingredients, like there's seed oils and grains in the dog biscuits.
Look, we've got chickens, and chickens are bribed because they love grain. We can go on. That's a whole pathway that everything in the animal kingdom likes free calories in some respect. But in nature, we're meant to eat calories in excess at a time at the end of summer, beginning of autumn, to store fat for winter hibernation. That is part of the life cycle. So we're completely wired to find sugar in nature, and hence we're highly addicted to it. But our chickens, I use wheat now because I can get that. But if you actually look at the chicken feed, it's actually got coated in seed oils now. Seed oils, just coating it because it decreases the dusting of it.
Well, that's right. It always comes down to cost, right? And it's like, okay, well, maybe the shelf life is longer, or maybe we can pad it out, or maybe it looks more filling. But the seed oils are never in there for some sort of health benefit.
No. Originally, they were, produced as lubricants, engine lubricants.
And now you go to the supermarket and everything, even the tin of tuna that says with olive oil is 20% olive oil. The rest is cut with sunflower oil or, something along those lines.
Do you know the reason for that in the supermarkets? When you actually see sun-dried tomatoes.
That's so disappointing as well.
Well, the reason they don't do that, they don't put just olive oil in there because when they cool them and refrigerate them, it congeals because whereas the vegetable oil, it will stay nice and liquidy.
Runny. Yeah.
And so I don't think I've had sun-dried tomatoes for years now. I know a technique of doing it myself, but life's busy.
You probably get them in Europe, although you're not traveling at the moment. But I'm sure the Europeans, or you could import them or something like that from with proper olive oil in there. Because I
I,
find that
I've,
when you go to Italy or you go overseas, they use the proper oil. They
yes.
don't buy into the seed oil.
Um, except, well, it depends on where you go overseas. I used to do a lot of foreign aid work in Vanuatu, where Coca-Cola and soft drinks were cheaper than bottled water,
Yeah.
a worry. And I can still remember um, just bottles just said vegetable oil and on it with nothing, no idea of exactly what was in it. It just said vegetable oil. And we know that you can't actually get an oil out of a vegetable. It's just bottles and bottles and bottles of it.
Yeah, I saw a big drum like that recently. I did like a day of volunteering in one of those kitchens where you feed the homeless, and there's this big drum, and it said something like seasonal vegetable oil, and it had this photo of like these beautiful vegetables sitting on like a wooden stump, and then I look behind, and it just says, I think it just said 90% grapeseed oil, like that. That was the ingredient, and then the rest, canola, soybean, whatever.
Well,
But it's got nothing to do with these seasonal vegetables.
well, I, I almost we don't go out to dinner much because Belinda I'll ask the chef what do they cook or what ask the waiter what is this being cooked in?
Mm.
Oh, it's the best sunflower oil. No, I don't. This is the best safflower oil. It's just. Um, we've got the highest quality cottonseed oil, and the one of the things I spent a long time working out is what's the half life of these omega-6 oils in our body.
Right.
Have you looked into that? So Glenn Lawrence is a professor of oil study. He's based in New York. He's written a
Wow.
book I've got somewhere. And he's written a couple of articles on it, which was a bit hard to find. And I actually contacted him because I said, I'm trying to find out the half-life of an omega-6 fatty acid, the inflammatory ones in the body. In our diet, we need a very small amount of it. We don't need 25% of our fat in our bodies now to be omega-6 linoleic acid. So I wrote to him and he said, I've written a book, Gary. Dear Gary, I've written a book. You might want to get it. So I got hold of the book and I read it from cover to cover. And I rang, and then I emailed him back and said, Glenn, can we have a Professor Lawrence, Glenn Lawrence, can we have a chat? Because I've read your book and you haven't answered my question. And I said, what is the half-life of an omega-6 fatty acid, the linoleic acid, in the body? And he said, he doesn't know. This is the professor of oils that spent his entire life. He said he's been trying to work it out. He thinks it's about 4 years.
Mm.
So therefore, if we eat one takeaway meal, which is whatever it's fried up in today, and that's seed oils, then those seed oils are going to hang around for 4 years in your body
Mm.
and have a pro-inflammatory effect for 4 years
Jeez, yeah.
before you get rid of half of them. And that's scary. Well, I've got so many stories now about people who actually changed to a low-carb, keto, carnivore diet, and they improved a lot, but they kept improving for 4 years. I've got permission to tell my story of my sister-in-law who was diagnosed with MS,
Mm.
and she came along on the crazy ride and actually improved her health.
Mm.
And at 4 years, she came off all of her medication and lost all of her symptoms.
Fantastic.
So, like everyone wants to have a quick fix, but it's just really interesting. If we've had a diet of, and this has been biopsied in people, whereas 100, 200 years ago, it was probably about 1% omega-6s in the fat in our body. And since 1950s, they've been measuring it and we've been steadily increasing it.
Mm.
And so it's probably mid to high 20s now on the last extrapolated data. And it's even found, they've actually measured in women's breast milk and they've compared US women's breast milk and compared it to African women's breast milk. And the US women's breast milk has got a higher content of omega-6. So one of my criticisms of the way we eat is that when a baby is born, it's already been raised on an inflammatory
Mm.
milieu of nutrients. It's been
Mm.
a high carb diet. Most mothers have got it, got rates of gestational diabetes out of control. But the fats that are crossing the placenta into the baby are the omega-6s, which can be are pro-inflammatory can be oxidized even before the baby's born. So it's no wonder to me that if you actually look at particularly those women with gestational diabetes, they've got a higher rate, those babies have got higher rates of abnormalities, of the environmental abnormalities rather than the chromosomal ones. Now, whether or not it's the high blood glucose crossing into the placenta, whether or not it's the overall diet, we don't know. But very clearly, out of control gestational diabetes has much higher complications with more learning problems in those children and more prone to obesity. So
That's sad, isn't it? Because it's through no fault of their own. Even before day one, they're being contaminated essentially.
well, I looked into that. Well, it's now 6 years ago because my granddaughter's 5. But essentially, Kate was pregnant and she had fairly heavy or big problems with morning sickness, and it made me think about the old wives' tale is that don't worry if you've got morning sickness, the baby will be healthy. And I thought, hang on, if she's got morning sickness and can't eat for days, she's clearly going to be in ketosis. So we measured her. She was in ketosis. And as it turns out, if you wanted to do an experiment on unborn babies and put them through dietary regimes then you'd never get it past an ethics committee. So you don't need to get it past an ethics committee, but by definition, severe morning sickness has been studied, and there are the results of tens of thousands of women have been followed for decades to see how the women go, how the pregnancy goes, and how the baby goes for the first 5 years. And what's very clear is the old wives' tale is correct. If you have severe morning sickness, you are more likely to go full term. You're more likely to have a baby of normal birth weight. You're more likely to have less complications, less miscarriages. The child is less likely to have birth defects, and the child will be healthier and less learning problems and will be functionally and academically fine. Whereas with gestational diabetes, which has again been studied in tens of thousands of women, and I'm talking a difference between first trimester and third trimester, but nonetheless, that's been well studied as well. And so all those things I mentioned before, birth weight problems, high and low, miscarriages, problems in the labour, the children's abnormalities, and then learning disabilities are far more likely. So all this data has been done, but I think it's a perfect example when people say, is keto safe? Is it safe for children? Well, in fact, babies, when they're first born, spend lots of times in ketosis. But they go into ketosis a lot easier than adults. And again, it's been studied, but you've got to drill down into the information to try and find it.
In that example there, where you're comparing the gestational diabetes with mothers who have morning sickness, who presumably can't eat, let's say, for an extended period of time, do you think it's the ketones, or is it the absence of toxins, from eating the correct thing?
I think morning sickness has been around before processed food.
Right, okay.
Number one.
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't have lots of literature about that from hundreds of years ago. But I actually think, and I'll call it God in inverted commas. I've written a book where I put God in inverted commas, but rather, we would imagine wherever you are, let's say in modern society, and you get a woman gets pregnant, she has early morning sickness. It's a way of the body saying, actually, don't give me anything. I don't want anything coming in which is bad. Yeah. I'm just going to clean up the system. I think that fasting and ketosis is actually a safety mechanism like on a computer. If you start in safe mode, sometimes if you reboot it, that is the simplest, safest operating system for the body. And our body will do that, whether or not it's in morning sickness, it will do it in fasting for surgery. If you're in hospital, you've had something done, you don't feel like eating. If you're in intensive care, you're not getting, until they put parenteral nutrition in, which is full of seed oils and sugar. But the fasting state is our protective mechanism to actually put us into the best healing state. We know that it's actually a period of cleansing apoptosis of damaged cells and of damaged mitochondria. It's a cleansing mechanism. And it's been observed for thousands of years in religion that fasting is actually a period of cleansing. So I think our forebears have known about it for a long time.
Mm.
I think, and the other thing is cultures, and this is what a lot of Belinda's work, and you've got to get her on and have a chat to her. Her recent work has been looking at cultures where the young male and the young female who are together in a community will be given the best nutrition,
Mm.
and the mother will be given excellent, as much nutrition as the community can give, so that she's has a good pregnancy. But we also know that if she's got reasonable nutrition and goes into ketosis, it's actually safe. So,
Mm.
our way of the animal kingdom does the same thing. It tends to the mother, so the children that are born, or the infants that are born, are nurtured into an environment which is safe, and it's just fuel. I mean, I think there are other chemicals. We talk about all the other toxins in society, and I think we're overwhelmed with them. But if you're in fasting, you're not getting any of them.
Yeah.
But it is that safe mode. Um, and I think it's another one of my adages that we tend to we pay more attention to what fuel we put in our cars than the fuel we put in our bodies. We don't go along and put diesel in our unleaded car engines and vice versa, and so you might get away with it for a tiny little bit. A little bit in moderation won't hurt. Well, of course it will to the car engine over time. And so many people look at others to help them when they've been eating badly for a long period of time. And my analogy that is, if you actually put the wrong fuel in your car over a period of time, you can spend as much time putting it in for a service and washing the car and cleaning the tyres and changing the tyres and doing the brakes, but nothing's going to get better until you get the right fuel in. And that fuel's got to be a complete fuel that's appropriate for the car, and the complete fuel that's appropriate for a human requires essential proteins, essential fats, essential micronutrients, essential minerals and vitamins, and it does not require a single carbohydrate.
Mm.
It's very hard to go zero carb, but that was my COVID project, to try and work out the toxic dose of carbs. If we're going to demonize them.
So like how many grams of carbohydrates per day or something can
Well,
someone handle?
at one time, is probably the better way to do it because of studies. And so my definition of toxicity was that if it has a negative impact on the system. So if you put a chemical in, if it has a positive impact or a negative impact on the system. And that talk called Carbohydrate Doses the Poison, it's on the internet. I go through it, and I did it as an academic argument. And I made an academic argument that the toxic dose, when it has a negative effect on the system, is 4 grams or 1 teaspoon or 1/5 of a slice of bread. So that starts to have a negative impact on the system.
Yep.
And it's been seen, I don't know, several 100,000 times, but nonetheless, I'm not getting kickback from it because I've just presented the biochemistry, the facts, the science of the studies that have been done, what effect it has on the blood vessels, what effect it has on the pancreas and insulin secretion, what it's doing to blood-brain barriers. It's all there. And I put forward the suggestion that the body actually sees that carbohydrate is dangerous. Everyone talks about carbs are essential, glucose is essential, but we've got every single mechanism in the body to get rid of carbs the moment it hits it. Because the moment your blood glucose spikes, it has all these impacts at different cells.
Hmm.
And so what happens if the body actually doesn't like glucose? Which is it's a reverse thought process. But we have all these mechanisms of clearing it out from the gut, storing it straight into the liver, get it out of the bloodstream. Under the influence of insulin, get it straight out into the muscle. Do not let it circulate. Fructose, which is half of sugar, gets primarily absorbed and metabolized out of the blood system in the liver. So very, very little fructose gets into the liver or gets past the liver. Not to say none, but it's just really interesting. We've got these mechanisms through glucagon, which is the reverse hormone of insulin, just to raise the blood glucose a tiny bit to help us, to keep things steady, because there are cells in the body that require glucose, but not ingested glucose. So the glucagon will keep that up there. We've got more mechanisms to get glucose out of the bloodstream than we have to get it in.
Mm.
So I actually think that it's been a con. So just to come back to seasonality, when you see carbs are seasonally available when fruit comes into ripeness, or if you want to break into a beehive and get some honey, or small amount in breast milk, but that's for babies. And when the other natural sources of it require processing, a grain of wheat requires processing before it can be digested. It needs to be ground down. And when we entered our agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago, I can look at the teeth. The molars on those teeth have started to be ground down because people tried to eat it. So we can see that dentition. We can also see from skeletons from that period of time, pre-agricultural revolution had no changes of osteoarthritis in the joints. Minimal. Following on from it, we started developing osteoarthritis of joints. And it's again, if we look at joints, glucose, virtually all damage in joints is the glycation of end products of carbohydrate metabolism. You don't see damaged proteins primarily causing arthritis of joints. You don't see damaged fats. All you do is you see damaged carbohydrate.
And yet, I mean, you must have heard this a million times as an orthopedic surgeon. The prevailing dogma is if your joints are wearing out, you've got arthritis, it's from overuse or carrying too much weight.
Over and over. However, the primary picture of osteoarthritis is in fact the hips, the knees, and the thumbs. Oh, hang on, let's not. So the base of the thumb is actually, so don't give me this nonsense about it being worn out
from carrying too much weight,
from a mouse or anything, using a computer mouse. We're no longer, climbing up and down from the river with our pails of water and having to wash everything down there or tend our fields by hand. So I think we defeat that argument of overuse because carpometacarpal osteoarthritis at the base of the thumb there is part of that overall picture of osteoarthritis.
And can I say that when you have somebody who comes in and who has, say, arthritis in their knees, is it generally pretty correlated that they're going to have the issue with the thumb as well?
High correlation.
Right.
Not 1-to-1, but it's high.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, in 2020, the Chinese did some studies on osteoarthritis of the knee and insulin levels. And they noted that when insulin levels went up, osteoarthritis cells became more inflamed. And when they reduced the insulin load upon those cells, it reduced. I was mind blown by that. So the trouble with that Chinese study is it suggested we should be managing insulin on people. I thought, well, hang on, why don't we just reduce insulin by reducing carbs? So if you don't eat carbohydrate, your body will not require the insulin. And we know that every single person, as far as I'm ever aware, when you reduce the carbohydrate load, the insulin load drops.
Yeah.
And I started recommending this to my patients, despite being in and out of trouble with all this. I said, look, there's good evidence here. Why don't you reduce the sugar and carbohydrate for the next 6 to 8 weeks, and I'll see you again and see how you're going. And I can remember one week where I had 8 people come in who had end-stage osteoarthritis of their knee, and if they'd seen anyone else in town, they would have had a knee replacement. And I said, come back and see me 6 to 8 weeks after you've done this. And these 8 patients all had no pain. and only one of them had lost any amount of weight. So they'd lost their pain before they lost weight. And all they'd done is taken sugar and carbs out. And one was a physio. She got a bit cranky. She lost half a kilo of weight. She was quite slim. She didn't want to lose weight. but she'd lost a little bit of weight. But she'd actually done a walking up to Cradle Mountain down to and
Mm.
Wineglass Bay just to push her knee because as a physiotherapist, she knew the troubles of a knee replacement. It's not a, don't for one moment think that having a knee replacement solves all of your problems and there are complications of surgery. So she was well aware of it and she just couldn't believe it. Her pain was gone. I'm not saying you don't ultimately need to have a knee replacement, but it puts that off. And in the meantime, your person is generally becoming more metabolic, better, getting better metabolic health, which is going to improve their general health, their well-being, their immune system, and their overall outcome from surgery.
Mm.
Again, it's just a complete no-brainer that if you improve the quality of the diet, you'll improve the quality of your health and you'll get a better patient outcome.
Yeah,
But you'll do less surgery.
it might seem like a no-brainer, but as I said, the prevailing dogma is too much weight, too much use equals joint damage. It's unavoidable. It's genetic. There's nothing you can do. Whereas, I think, well, I hope that we'll start to see long-term low carb, long-term carnivores who live a really long, healthy life with healthy joints. I mean, probably Sean Baker's probably a good example.
Yeah,
Very
well,
active guy.
Sean got into the same trouble, well, similar trouble to myself. I helped him out with this case. And Sean's, he was ended up doing less surgery. And because his practice, his hospital wanted him to do more surgery and more patients, and he was cutting back on the amount of surgery because his patients didn't need it. I've got a great picture of, I caught up with, I helped, it's quite a lot of people get into trouble with the medical regulatory authorities. So I've helped out many people around the world. I helped out Ken Berry, who wrote the foreword for his book, helped Sean with his case. And I've got a picture of Ivor Cummings, which some people know, and Andreas Infeld. Andreas said, "Oh, you are the bad boys." And I've got a great picture. I'm not tiny. I'm about 5'11", but I've got a pic. I'm just this little guy between Sean Baker and Ken Berry. I'm having this good old man hug and this sort of. And look, one of the things, it's a great community right around the world. These are people who are standing up, going against the grain, literally, and seeing the success for their patients, themselves, their families, their communities, and standing up and becoming a force. Little known fact, I presented the very first low carb conference in Indonesia for Southeast Asia was in Jakarta.
Mm.
And I presented there with Georgia Reed and Eric Westman. And we were the three.
What year was this?
Oh, a few years ago now. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And we went there with and so the Indonesian community asked us to speak. There were three overseas guests and three Indonesian doctors who wanted to speak. Fascinating meeting because as we're talking, our lectures are being converted into Indonesian when the Indonesian speakers were converted. A lot of work went into it. But I knew it was a serious event because the people who were running it had problems because the processed food industry wanted the venue shifted. We had armed we had armed guards as we were travelling around, checking the cars for bombs and whatever. It was just phenomenal. But what was really interesting out of that is there's a group called Ketosis, and they're a low-carb Facebook group based in Indonesia. To our north, there are 300, that group has over 340,000 members
Wow.
who are keto carnivore, who are not eating the fruit, the vegetables, and the rice.
Mm.
So if you're in the keto carnivore community, we've got 340,000 friends just up in Indonesia.
Yeah,
It's
that's
a
amazing.
phenomenal amount.
Yeah, I should look into that. That is very interesting. Should
And
do a regenerate in Indonesia.
well, you could. No, but that was just, and we were treated like royalty. It was just a great trip
Mm.
and hot and sweaty, but nonetheless.
Mm.
But so this is a worldwide phenomenon, and that's 340,000 people are going against their guidelines, but they're
Yeah.
doing what they require. They need to do this for their own health and well-being.
And also their culture, because, in
Hmm.
Asia, there's an assumption that, okay, we've been eating, 90% of our calories from rice
Well,
forever,
no,
right?
No, no, that's not the culture. The culture is that over time, traditionally, there's been a, a meat-based diet with some vegetables to the side and a small portion of a unprocessed rice. We're talking about a cupful, not the Chinese restaurant plateful that we have here in Australia. And so they had a diet which is small portions. And they had also, up until recently, their diet was predominantly palm oil. And palm oil is actually very low in the omega-6s. So palm oil it may be bad for the orangutans because they chop the rainforest down, but it's actually quite a healthy oil,
Interesting.
healthier than the other canola oils and the vegetable oils and the polyunsaturated seed oils. So, and so the whole problem in Asia at this point in time, again, they've got some of the fastest growing rates of obesity, metabolic health problems, and it's the introduction of higher amounts of highly processed grains and rice and pushing the amount of rice that's required, but
Mm.
also that combination with, which I think makes the perfect storm, which is the seed oils that are creeping in because they're cheap, they're transportable,
Mm.
and so part of me is bewildered and part of me is, you know, what can we do? But then we're having a chat now, which is an explosion of information in comparison with 15 years ago when
Yeah.
I was starting to talk about it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think this information really needs to get out there. And there is a big education component because even when you were sort of earlier on describing your philosophy, which was local, seasonal, real food, even that message has been totally corrupted
Mm,
because I think the perception of what a plate of food looks like today is completely off scale in relation to what humans should really be eating. You
mm,
go to a restaurant or you eat out or you look at a typical plate of food, and the meat and healthy fat portion of that plate is just so small. Even if you think about, say, like a burger and chips and a drink and a soft drink or something, it's 90% plus
So
carbohydrates and sugar
why is it called soft drink?
because it's not alcoholic, maybe
It's
not hard.
no, no, it's just another part of the health washing.
Yeah.
It's a
That's like a sort of
a high sugar carbonated beverage. No, oh no, it's a soft drink. Yeah, see how we've all been corrupted by this
yeah,
language,
yeah,
and it's just interesting how it just so easily flows off. Oh, it's a soft drink.
yeah.
It's like it's
But you just look at a typical plate of food, and I think people don't realize that the bun is pure carbohydrate. And, the chips and the rice and the pasta and all of that is just pure carb, which is completely unessential, as you're saying. And you've got to squint to try and find a little bit of meat. Um,
I,
you know,
I put. I'm a great believer in appropriate use of continuous glucose monitors, little CGMs. You put them on the arm, you measure your blood glucose because that is giving individualized care. When people say, "Are you saying this generalized statement?" I know if we put a glucose monitor on, we can find what food that people eat does to them.
mm,
And for every single person who does it, it's a learning experience. For 99% of people, when they have a meal of carbohydrates, their blood glucose goes up. And as I've said before, the moment your blood glucose level goes up, you are causing some damage in some corner of the body. A lot of that's repairable, but if you keep doing it every single day, or 3 or 4 or 6 times a day, there is chronic damage. So I'm a great believer in glucose monitors. Last state election, because we seem to have one every 18 months down here in Tasmania, I put glucose monitors on both sides of politics, and they and their teams lost 50 kilos of weight in the 6 week election period. And
wow.
then I said, okay, if it's good enough for you, what about for the people? So I've had bipartisan meetings at Parliament House. Said I'd come down if you give me a good steak. Look, it was a terrible advertisement for Tasmania. The worst steak I've ever had in my life was served to me at Parliament House. It was chewy in it. Anyway, so go to any restaurant in Tasmania, you're going to get a good steak, okay?
Mm,
Don't eat your steak at Parliament House. Um, but The frustrating thing for me is that every time I catch up with politicians, I offer them money. I never sort of ask for something which is going to cost the system money.
Mm.
I'm going to say, look, this has got a benefit. This is not just got a health benefit, it's got a financial benefit. Yeah, that's the, and yet, despite the fact that I offer between $1 million and $50 billion, depending on which politicians I've caught up with, on an annual basis, it doesn't go into their pocket. I can still remember catching up with one of the pollies, and her aide was sitting there. I said, look, I know you're taking minutes. Could you please note that I am bribing the minister here with $30 billion per annum? Could you write it down? Just say, note that Dr. Fettke is offering $50 billion. I think it's $50 billion. And that's the cost. If you can actually turn around the cost of, one of the times I got reported to the medical board for inappropriately reversing someone's type 2 diabetes on national TV. People will go, you're kidding. I go, no, I'm not actually kidding. It was reported for it was inappropriate to do it. And yet we've got the ability to turn people's diabetes around within 24, 48 hours. We've got, you know this, Anthony knows this. We all know that if you actually take a diet, you stop eating unnecessary carbohydrate, you will reverse your diabetes. You'll get better control of it. Whether or not you'll be fully cured depends on whether it's type 1, type 2, whether or not you go back to eating it. Whether or not you reverse the damage already may depend on different organs. But nonetheless, you've got the ability to get total control or dramatic control with a reduction of medications as well, with a low carbohydrate interference. And this saves the hospital system $50 billion per annum, roughly, give or take $10 billion in Australia on an annual basis. Now, that money, unfortunately, will mean less money for the pharmaceutical industry and less money for the ultra-processed food industry. It means, from my point of view, less money for the farmers that are producing the cereals, the grains, the canola oils. But they could do
Hopefully
the
more for the
regenerative.
beef farmers. Yeah.
Well, the vast majority of our animal-based agricultural industry is on non-arable land. It's not on the most arable land. It's on the sloped land. It's on that 4% or 20% of the world's surface.
And it's fully free range and organic up in the Northern Territory and Northern WA, where the cattle aren't seen for a year until they're rounded up and, sometimes put on a ship and sent away.
We caught up obviously at the Regenerate meeting, and for me, it's so frustrating to see the path which has greater noise. And you should have a chat to Belinda about the blue zones. And I know she presented there, but she's done further work.
Great.
And we watched the blue zones on Netflix through clenched teeth, pushing this plant-based agenda. But on one of the community tables, there was a huge leg of lamb being cut up. But Dan Butner, failed to point that out, that this is what they're eating as their staple diet is an animal-based one. Yet the messages coming out from something like Netflix or from we've got to go towards this plant-based diet. And it's not based on good science. It's definitely not based on good biochemistry. The outcomes aren't as predicted. I'll talk about the blue zone thing because we watched it only just recently. I said, do I really have to watch this? He said, no, but I'd like you to. And there's to give my opinion on it as well. And Dan Button is saying, the Adventist health studies show this. Now, the Adventist health studies, it's done by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, based primarily around Loma Linda in California. Yep. They re-quote their own articles, their own studies 400, 500 times, so it seems to be well and truly peer-reviewed. But it's not, it's in-house. But what's really interesting, and I was talking about the Adventist health studies because they are the most quoted study in the world on the benefits of vegetarian vegan food. And do you know what the definition of a vegetarian is? They're eating meat less than once a week.
Meat less than once a week, right? Okay.
Yeah, hang on, they're still eating meat.
Yeah.
But that's vegetarian. And what about vegan? They're eating
No,
meat less than once a month.
yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
So it's not, they're not vegan.
Would you,
They're not.
because there's a great doctor on social media called Ankur, who's a emergency doctor out of India. I don't know if you've checked him out. You'd really enjoy talking to him. Um, he has all these patients coming to him, and they say they're omnivores. And
Mm,
then he asks these patients, "Well, how often do you eat meat?" And it's like, "I eat two eggs and one small piece of meat a week,"
yeah.
and they're omnivores. So, but I suppose in this definition, he's put them in the vegetarian camp.
Now, I've actually done a podcast with him. He's a funny guy.
Yeah, he's great.
But we, if you believe the vegan agenda, then they're definitely not having anything to do with animal product.
It should be zero.
And the trouble is, even the vegetarian communities, the vast majority of them through Southeast Asia, are cooking their foods in an animal-based product, particularly ghee. And so they are getting the small amounts of micronutrients, the fat-soluble vitamins that they need. But those communities have incredibly high rates of iron deficiency anemias, particularly the women.
Low B12,
Low B12, yeah. So
diabetes through the
but
roof.
but they are vegetarian with low animal red meat intakes. Well, I'm going to call it low meat intakes because I gave a talk to the meat industry. Why is it? Why do we call it red meat?
Because it's
Well,
red.
no, it's not. Pork's a red meat. It's white. Chicken's a red meat. A meat. So why have we demonized red meat over white meat or orange meat or yellow meat? I actually remember the Black Lives Matter. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. There's a whole lot
Unfortunately,
of
yes.
politics about that. I actually used the hashtag at that point in time called hashtag Red Meat Matters. Linda said, "You really don't want to do that." And I said, "Yeah, yes." I said, "Why not put it up on Twitter and X and all that sort of thing?" Because why are we discriminating a meat, an animal-based product based on color? If I think about it, why are we discriminating against people based on color? And so we're now politically correct. Well, stop discriminating against meat and just call it meat. Um, Belinda's just written. She's finally writing her book. She's getting on doing it all, and I know I'm sort of seem to be advertising my wife. She's an amazing person, but she's written an entire chapter about pigs. Because
Hmm.
different religions, different communities have different beliefs about things, and you may or may not be surprised. It all comes down to power struggles and control, and it's been happening for hundreds, if not thousands, of years, depending on different influences.
Hmm.
And those things that can be kept by the people versus can be taxed by the
Yeah.
powers.
Um,
And
and a pig perhaps can live in a very confined area,
yes, under the house.
not for the peasants.
Well, no, demonized in religion by the powers.
Yeah, that's what I mean to keep them off them.
Yeah, but however, they surreptitiously use them. So therefore, even though it's a dark sort of thing to have, and she can go into great detail. She wax lyrically about it, but it's so much of what we've been told of to eat comes down to power and politics and religious belief, and it doesn't come back down to actual environmental requirements. And when you actually take it back down to biochemistry, and I'm not for saying I'm not pro industrial food pathways, and factory farming and all that sort of thing. But we come back to our fresh local produce, support the local farmer, who's hopefully moving more and more. And a lot of farmers are starting to move towards a more regenerate practice and looking after the land. But then the big corporates come in and try and take the land, and that's part of the land grab, and that becomes a whole economic shift as well. I'm very interested in the fourth turning. Have you come across that?
I've heard a little bit about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really interested. I've been doing a lot of reading about that and the cyclical natures. It's actually given me quite a lot of inner peace because if you actually look out at the media and you look out at the world and everything, it's total chaos. We've got children, we've got grandchildren, and trying to actually gain some sort of concept of where the hell the world's heading. it seemed, and I've actually, most societies, particularly Western societies, run through four turnings that last between 20 and 25 years, and we're in a period of chaos at the moment. And unfortunately, it generally ends in a period of a major world war or some sort of strife like that. But then there's a complete refocus of society on what's right and wrong,
Hmm.
good and proper. And when I look through the lens of the concept that society runs in cycles, an 80-year cycle for societies, then there's a 250-year cycle of revolutions, and there's a 100-year cycle of currencies, and they all start to be blending in at the one time right about now. We've got total chaos around us. And part of that is this plant-based agenda, which makes no sense. Biochemically, environmentally, we've talked about this, how plant-based cropping actually takes nutrients out of the soil. Animal-based cropping or farming puts nutrients back into the soil. The centralisation of profits and society. And I think we're at the next phase we're going through is a period of decentralisation. Comes back to our decentralisation of our food, our property, our financing, our communities. I was supposed to do a TED talk at the beginning of 2000, but it got cancelled because of COVID. And the gist of it was, and then they asked me to do it at the end of 2000 via video. And I said, no, I can't do it because it just happened.
Hmm.
But without being smart, I actually described COVID happening
Hmm.
because of all the things that were coming together in 2019. I compared it to factory farming. So if you put, and then the fact that I thought the world was, most humans are actually being factory farmed. So if you put animals in a bad environment, you give them bad food and you crowd them in, then ultimately they are prone to getting a single virus or a single disease that comes through and creates great havoc, and then you've got a cold. But we as humans have been factory farmed probably since the 1970s when we really bumped up our processed food intake. And in that process, we started putting people more and more in cities, more and more high rises, giving them poorer and poorer quality food. We've developed this metabolic syndrome, which is completely out of control. 92.7%, I think 93% before, but that's the last figure that's been measured of the population of metabolically unwell. Then it was only needed one virus, one thing to come through and create an enormous amount of havoc. But all TED Talks have got to finish on a good note. You can't actually make everyone depressed at the end of it. So the answer really was that we need to decentralise our population, decentralise our food, and Tasmania is a great example of that. And as it turns out, through COVID, we fared pretty well through the whole craziness. And so I think we're going to go through, my prediction going forward is we are going to have a more decentralised society, more decentralised communities, decentralised currencies, decentralised government, come back more to a local government scenario. Hopefully it's not quite feudalism, but nonetheless, it'll be a different transition. And in the process of that, we'll be going back to eating more fresh, local, seasonal, whole food. And with that may be an improvement in our metabolic health, because whatever we're doing at the moment is completely and utterly unsustainable.
Hmm.
And it's stupidly being blamed on animals. Here's a little trivia bit I only heard yesterday. I think I popped something in my talk about what, I think if you remember it, what are the biggest producers of methane on the planet? And it's cockroaches, scarab beetles, termites, and millipedes.
Yeah.
And they produce about 25% of the methane on the planet. And not many of them, they only produce a little bit, but there's trillions of them. And infinitely more than cows, which is part of a circular thing. The big AI computers are now, a lot of them, and a growing number of them, are being using methane to cool them. So we're on this AI revolution at the moment, which is really interesting because it needs to actually drag power for it, but they also need to be cooled. So if you want to cool your computers, you need to either use potable water, so drinking water. So you might have, I used an example of Arizona. It's got ample solar energy, but it's got no water. But they've put a big AI plant out there, but they don't actually have the water to cool them.
Oh, wow.
So therefore, we're losing water to our AI move, and yet um, uh, but in the process of that, we're taking away our water, but our water is required for our people, our health, our well-being, because we just can't keep, shipping in Coca-Cola or other soft drinks. And but we're now having our energy requirements cooled by methane.
This is progress.
Well, it's just it's Belinda will use the term moral gymnastics.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. That's a good way of putting it, I think. There's a
and it,
justification for all these actions, and it comes back to generally profits, sometimes ideology.
well, Belinda will talk about its profits in both spellings because it's PROFIT and PROPHET. And a lot of people end up spending, if they spend too much time listening to me, I seem to be quite cynical, and I am, but I'm also looking forward to, okay, what are the exit strategies here? What are the exit strategies from our children and our grandchildren? Um, our son's very high. I don't know if he's running it or pretty well close to running the whole AI pathway for Telstra. So William and I have multiple, we have many philosophical discussions. I send him this talk and he sends me this talk, and whether we have a listen to it. So our children are part of the future, as are our grandchildren. And so we're trying to create a safe environment for a questioning environment. And if we, and part of it is raising this awareness, because I think you and I agree that there's, unless we travel the path of real food and support our farming communities accordingly, we are completely up the creek without a paddle. I left out
100%.
a word in there, up the creek, didn't I?
Yeah, I think I can guess. All right, Dr. Gary Fettke, let's finish there. You've delivered a wealth of information. Very grateful for that, and I think I'm definitely going to get Belinda on here, and we might need to do a follow-up chat as well because I'm sure there's many more topics we can dive into. Thank
Well,
you very much for your time.
we've been interviewed a couple of times together, but it's quite interesting who gets the first word in, and we need marriage counselling after it.
That's what I had envisaged for Regenerate, but I know it couldn't happen like that. It actually happened. I think it worked out better because we got two more unique talks. But yeah, I could imagine the two of you together
Yeah,
reminding each other of different things.
Kim Morrison did one with us together about life and love, and I think we just laughed and laughed and laughed, the three of us, for an hour and a half. I don't know how much information we gave out, but it was just
Yeah.
a very and there was a couple, Australia's oldest married couple was in the news a couple of weeks ago. They were 80-year wedding anniversary. I don't know if you saw that.
80 years. It's a good effort.
And I said to Blue, because we're 40 years, I said, we've only got another 40 to go. And she said, no way. No
Yeah.
way.
She's going to tap out.
Be interesting world another 40 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm naturally very optimistic, but I think your kind of decentralized argument, or hopefully that it moves that way, even decentralized thought and independent thought and freedom to share ideas, as long as we're moving towards that, and you can do, like you said, everyday things like supporting a local farmer who is grassroots, who doing the right thing and isn't captured by a giant corporation, is something small you can do.
Well, as we're speaking right now, it's about 7 o'clock, and Belinda, I know, is outside cooking lamb chops.
On the barbecue.
Because we've got no, not a barbecue. We cook outside well, I used to call it the vegetable garden. It's now a propagation garden, and she's out there because the chops come from our son-in-law's family farm, and we barter. I give them medical advice, and they give us lamb chops in constant supply. But you can't cook them inside because this fat goes everywhere. So I'll
Yeah.
be sneaking out for a lamb chop after this.
Oh, fantastic. I might have to do the same. All right. Dr.
All right,
Fettke, thank you so much. I really
Simon,
appreciate that.
thank you. Keep well, mate. Bye bye.